Back in the 1970s, after we had this guy, we had this game you play on the telly called Pong. There wasn't really a console war back in that time. All that really came out was the Magnavox Odyssey and a bunch of plug-and-play consoles. The second generation or first generation of game consoles started in 1976 and ended in 1983 when the video game crash started. Again, there wasn't really a console war until when the Atari 2600, which took the world by storm, and nobody saw it coming. The Atari 2600 sold like hotcakes in the late 70s and early 80s. Atari was first founded in 1972 by Nolan Bushnell and Ted Dabney. The two met in college and University of Utah, and before the 2600, Atari made the first Pong arcade cabinet and eventually made home Pong sets and then made the Atari 2600, the first console that uses cartridges to be successful. The first console to use removable cartridges is the Fairchild Channel F. The console came out a year before the Atari 2600 in 1976. The Fairchild Channel F is a well-known console on the internet today, and it was a pretty cool console for its time, but the Atari 2600 kicked its ass. Arcades were starting to get popular with games like Asteroids, Space Invaders, Pac-Man, Breakout, and etc. There were ports of popular arcade games being released on the Atari 2600, and people thought it was awesome being able to play these games at home. Yeah, they are downgraded versions of the arcade versions, but they play fine and they did the job well. There were even games exclusive to home consoles like Yar's Revenge, Pitfall. Activision made a lot of classic games on the Atari 2600 that helped the console sell. Atari back in the day felt invincible, but that doesn't mean the Atari 2600 had competitors. Two of Atari's competitors stood out, the Intellivision and the Colecovision. What's different about these consoles is that they are for a slightly older audience and have more complicated games and more sports games. Both consoles have these weird controllers that are phones. There aren't really a whole lot of uses of the buttons on the controllers anyway. Developers who make games on the Intellivision spread out the buttons so they can have as much use of the keypad as possible. Most of the games on both consoles were as basic as Atari, so why do these consoles need this many buttons on their controllers? I have no idea. Flaw number 2 is that a lot of the games are straight up copies of Atari games. The Colecovision was superior to the Intellivision, but both consoles fought well. Now with the other competitors, we have the Vectrex and the Magnavox Odyssey 2. The Vectrex has its own television set and plays games in LED graphics, like arcade games in the 70s, and has overlays for color. With the Magnavox Odyssey 2, it's basically a giant keyboard made into a game console you play on your lap. In between the original Magnavox Odyssey and the Magnavox Odyssey 2, Magnavox made home Pong machines named after the thousands digits. Despite the many competitors and Atari being popular with the 2600, Atari made another game console called the 5200. The console featured arcade graphics and better graphics than its competitors, and features like a pause button and a power button right on the controller, like controllers we have today. Atari decided to copy the Intellivision and Colecovision controllers and make a keypad. It was awesome that the Atari 2600 controller had a power button and pause buttons on the controller, but the joystick was so fragile. After only a few weeks or days, the joysticks just broke. Third parties made better controllers, replacing the controller that came with the console. Most of the games were just ports of Atari 2600 games with better graphics, so many people just bought and stuck with the 2600 because it was cheaper and it was basically the same thing as the 5200. Even if the 5200 failed, Atari still made a fair share of money, but the money was coming from the 2600 and their home computers. Then, the video game crash of 1983 happened. Atari felt too invincible and kept throwing crap out, and they didn't care because as long as they made money, they were happy. Games around the late 70s and early 80s usually took around 6 months to make and put them on cartridges and then sell them in stores. Today, usually games take like 3 or 4 years depending on the genre. Some games take forever to come out, like Team Fortress 2 and Duke Nukem Forever. Atari started rushing their own games out, and games only took 6 weeks to make. That's probably not a good business practice. Pac-Man on the Atari 2600 was the best-selling Atari 2600 game, selling 7 million copies. Also, Pac-Man was considered to be one of the worst ports of any game ever. Then a pretty obscure game that came out, I don't know if a lot of people know about. E.T., a movie-based game made by Howard Scott in 5 weeks to the Christmas of 1982 deadline. Howard Scott previously made Yar's Revenge and another game based on a Steven Spielberg movie, Raiders of the Lost Ark. In 1983, Atari, who once dominated the market, lost $500 million and lost $2 million a day. The company started cutting its workforce from 10,000 to 400. Not a good sign. This was like the Great Depression of the video game industry. There was an over-exaggeration of games and consoles, so American retailers lost interest and people lost interest in buying video games. Many unsold copies of games were buried in a New Mexico landfill. The Colecovison, Intellivision, Magnavox Odyssey 2, all of those consoles discontinued, and all of those consoles had a pretty short lifespan. Everyone died basically, so who is the winner of the console war? Drumroll! The Atari 2600 won. The Atari 2600 sold 30 million units worldwide, and it was the only console to survive the video game crash of 1983. The Intellivision sold 3 million units, and the Colecovision sold 2 million units, and the Atari 5200 sold only 1 million units. Not only the Atari 2600 was the best-selling console at the time, but it became one of the longest-lasting game consoles. Games were still coming out in the 80s and early 90s during the NES, SNES, and Sega Genesis until 1992, when the Atari 2600 finally officially discontinued. The Nintendo Entertainment System was popular in the late 80s, but a good amount of kids still had the 2600. It might have something to do with strict parents. That's a pretty good theory why game consoles can last a long time. I want a Nintendo for Christmas! Fuck you, Billy, you have an Atari! Yeah!